Hey everyone, welcome to a video where we're going to be translating Philippians 1:16 through 17. And before we do, we need to take a quick look at verse 15 because verses 16 and 17 refer to what he's talking about here in verse 15. And I've also here provided my own translation. When we're translating, there's probably going to be some variation between our translations, and that's okay. For instance, we're going to see a series of prepositions, starting with dia, which we see right there. And we see it again right here, of course, in its contracted form. And then in verse 16 and 17, he's going to use another preposition which apparently has the same meaning. It's ek, or x. And so there's a few different ways this can be described accurately in English. And so if there's some variation, that's okay. We just want to make sure we do our very best at getting at the exact sense in our English translation. And so verse 15, I've translated it. Some indeed preach Christ, which that doesn't show up until down here, but this is what he's talking about in the first part of verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ out of phonon is envy, and erin would be strife. And then I've translated the men de construction here. We've got men right there, we've got de right here, as indeed and but. Indeed and but. Now, there's a few possibilities with the men de construction, but here he's using men de to describe a contrast. And so, again, there's a few different ways that can be described, but this is the way I've chosen to do it. And but others preach him, and so down here he does say preach Christ specifically, but I've decided to clarify that here in the first part of verse 15. Some indeed preach Christ out of envy and strife, but others preach him out of eudokion would be goodwill. And so once we've established a translation for verse 15, we'll be ready to move on to verses 16 and 17. Before we start translating, I want to make a quick overview of some of the interesting features so we can be a little more ready to translate them when we get there. The first one would be the first word of verse 16 is hoi. Of course, this is the article in Greek, and it's plural, and he's using it here as a kind of pronoun marker to refer to those who preach Christ out of love, which would be the group that he just described at the end of verse 15. And then he's going to use the same pronoun marker, the article again, to refer to the former group that preaches out of eretheas, or selfish ambition. And so here in this construction we see the x as well in both verse 16 and 17, which seems to be taking on the same meaning or the same force as the dia. Some might say, well, I want to translate dia a little differently from x. That's fine, but they do seem to be functioning synonymously. One verb that might just look a little different is eidotes, which is a participle that forms from oida, which means I know, and this verb forms a little differently than other verbs in the New Testament, so we'll just quickly mark that. Another verb I want us to keep our eye on is kemai. Kemai means to set or to place, and here it's translated I am set or I am placed. And it's going to be interesting to figure out, well, what is he talking about? He's placed as an apostle to preach the gospel. Maybe that, is he talking about being placed literally in prison? And that's, I think, is the sense here. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I think right here it's going to be interesting. He's talking about being placed in prison. And then down here too is an interesting concept when he says these people, whoever they are that are preaching Christ out of selfish ambition, they are supposing to raise affliction to his bonds. And I've commented on the meaning of this, the probable meaning of this in our video over the highlights, the grammatical highlights of chapter 1. But when we get there, that'll be interesting to think about as well. So let's begin our translation here in verse 16. The hoi is the article. It's a functioning like a relative pronoun, a pronoun marker, to talk about this latter group that he just described in verse 15. So let me go ahead and put that down. This latter group, and I'm going to translate men as indeed. This latter group, indeed, and he's talking about preaching Christ. Doesn't show up here in Greek, but that is the idea. It's probably helpful to clarify that to our English audience, or even if we're just translating for ourselves. So this latter group, indeed, I'm going to put this in parentheses, preaches Christ, and X, I'm going to translate that out of love. As far as the meaning of prepositions goes, a lot of times they're spatial. Sometimes they carry more, they're more conceptual. But you might remember studying when we looked at ek or ex, it has this idea of coming out of. And so in verse 15, when he says dia, when they preach through envy and strife, or they preach through goodwill, this seems to be the idea that this is what's coming out of their heart, and the ek is what comes from the heart into the manifestation of that which is their preaching publicly. So we've got so far this latter group indeed preaches Christ out of love, and then the participle, knowing that, and then he says, eis apologian. Of course, that's where we get our word for apologist. It's to make a defense. It's to show the coherency, the legitimacy, the relevance of something. And in English, we might have to rearrange this a little bit. Knowing that I am placed, keme, we're going to translate that first. Knowing that I am placed, and I'm going to go ahead and put in parentheses here, because I think he's talking about being placed in prison. When we think about Christ's prophecy to his apostles that they would have to appear before governors and kings to give a defense of the gospel, that seems to be what's in Paul's mind here. Why is he imprisoned if he's doing good? Well, he's placed specifically there in prison to appear before kings and governors in order that the gospel might spread. And he's placed there, eis apologian, tu evangeliu. I am placed here for a defense of the gospel. We might notice that the word apologian does not have an article. And there are times when Greek has an article and in English we won't provide it. It just doesn't make much sense. And there's other times where in Greek it doesn't have an article and we may want to provide it. It depends on the context, because the article is used a little differently in Greek than it is in English. Now, if we say the defense of the gospel, that might make sense. He's placed there for the defense of the gospel, and that all of us, to some degree, especially the apostles, were participating in this defense of the gospel so that it could spread on a world level. But at the same time, the Apostle Paul was one who God was using to give a defense of the gospel. And so I guess we could go back and forth in a debate about what is better, a defense or the defense, but I'm going to choose a defense here. And then we see hoi again, but this time he's talking about those who do not preach from goodwill in their hearts. And so we'll say the former group. But, translate des, but, the former group preaches, and I'm going to do the same thing which I did earlier, preaches him, because we've already specified that it's Christ in English, out of selfish ambition. And then we see uk agnos, not sincerely, and then we're down in the bottom line here. Oiomenoi would be supposing, they are supposing. Supposing, again, to raise. Philippians would be affliction. And then we've got a dative construction here, too, my, and desmois can be translated chains or maybe bonds, perhaps even imprisonment. But I'm just going to go with the word chains. Supposing to raise affliction to my chains. Paul later goes on to say that, I'm going to rejoice either way because Christ is preached. And the fact of the matter is, whenever the name of Christ is preached, even if it's not with the purest motives, that people hear about the Son of God and they have the opportunity to believe in him and to be saved. And this is what the Apostle Paul lived for. This competition, represented by this phrase right here, was not necessary. The gospel does not correspond to selfish ambition, but the power of the gospel is seen that when the name of Christ is preached, people can be saved, and that's something that the Apostle Paul rejoiced in. This verse is a good challenge to us to evaluate our motives. We're not in competition with anybody. We want to make sure that we're preaching Christ out of love. Thanks a lot for watching this video. I hope it's helpful to you as you translate through the rest of this paragraph.